Good afternoon, everyone. It's not nearly as cold as I feared, but I know it is cold. Is anyone live? Okay. Through Vignaraja, former Deputy Attorney General of Maryland, here on behalf of Linda Batts, former Director of Equity at the Department of Public Works with the City of Baltimore. Also joining me today is Clarence Thomas, the recently newly elected Vice President of Local 44, the AFSCME Public Sector Employees Union. Ms. Batts was a revered public servant in federal government for years. For a career, she fought discrimination at the highest levels, going from important roles in one federal agency to another. She was the person in federal government trying to make sure that our civil rights laws were honored and followed at the highest levels. When she had an opportunity to do that same work here in the city of Baltimore, she leaped for it. She became the first ever Director of Equity at the Department of Public Works, candidly an agency that has been inequitable for a generation and was in desperate need of exactly her talent, conviction, experience, and courage. When she was hired in July of 2019, she immediately got to work. In the months that followed, she investigated complaints of racial discrimination at one facility after another. She spoke up on behalf of women who were not given the same access to bathroom facilities as their male counterparts. She learned of employees who were fired simply for raising the question of pay equity, and she flagged for her supervisors that itself was illegal retaliation. From July of 2019 through the day she was fired in March of 2021, she did what she was hired to do, to uncover and fight for examples of discrimination that needed to be rooted out from the bottom to the very top. Her supervisors were the kind of folks who talked at press conferences about the importance of equity and diversity and inclusion. Those are values that all of us should find valuable, but it can't just be lip service. It can't just be a pretext. It can't just be what you say when you're on the national news. Ms. Batts believes in diversity and equity and fought for those things, not as fine words at press conferences, but as values that embody who we are as a city. And for fighting for those values that she believed in, she was herself a victim of racial discrimination and retaliation. For fighting for exactly the values she was brought in to defend on behalf of others, she herself found herself to be the latest victim of Baltimore City's refusal to honor the law. That was 2019, 2020, 2021. Soon thereafter, she gathered herself and filed a complaint, as is required under federal law, with the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And the EEOC, after conducting its own investigation, confirmed that there was in fact evidence of violations of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And after a long, drawn-out process, in December of 2025, Ms. Batts finally learned that she'd been issued a right to sue. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the process, in this country, if you want to sue under the federal employment statutes, you first have to go to the EEOC. And that process takes time, but eventually they release a right to sue letter, and then, and only then, here we are in February of 2026, can she file a lawsuit in federal court seeking redress for the crimes, for the injustices that were perpetrated against her back in 2019 and 2020 and 2021. The city had a chance when the EEOC had its ruling to do right by Ms. Batts, to negotiate a resolution to this. They didn't even pick up the phone or answer the letters from the EEOC. And so here we are in February of 2026, just last week, having at last filed a federal discrimination lawsuit on behalf of the first ever Director of Equity at the Department of Public Works. I've stood at this very spot speaking on behalf of employees of the Department of Public Works for years. So has Ms. Batts. She tried to work from within the system to root out the very conditions that resulted in the death of Ronald Silver, the very conditions that resulted in the inhumanity that sanitation workers and wastewater engineers have faced for years. And her reward for that was to be given a pink slip. Her reward for fighting for the conditions that would have prevented the very worst injustices that this city and that agency have seen is to be told, you're not needed here. You're making too much noise. You're fighting a little too hard for these employees. It is telling to me that I've seen allegations like this before. I've seen employees come forward and say, I was wronged by the system. Ms. Batts is an illustration of how hard it is to get your day in court. She was hired in 2019, fired in 2021. Here we are 5 years later, finally begin a chance to file that federal lawsuit. But this is a remarkable moment for another reason. Because for all of those allegations, for all of those instances, including when we stood here and fought for Ronnie Silver and his co-worker Travis Christian, this is the very first time I have ever seen a representative of our local union standing in solidarity and support for an employee who was mistreated. Clarence Thomas, along with Stancil McNair, along with their colleagues, promised a new era at Local 44, a new union that would actually speak up, not on behalf of the city and the mayor and the agency heads, but on behalf of the employees. And so it is remarkable to me that it has taken that long for the union to stand up on behalf of its workers. But that's progress in the city. That election was contested when Mr. McNair won it the first time fairly and squarely, and he was forced to go win it a second time. And Clarence Thomas and Linda Batts, were not unfamiliar to these fights. They've been fighting these battles inside of City Hall, inside of their agency, and on the streets, in front of cameras, quite literally for decades. But now they're joining forces. They're standing shoulder to shoulder and reminding this city that enough is enough. If you care about equity, if you care about diversity, don't just talk about it when the cameras are on. Do something about it in the agencies where equity and diversity is valued and desperately needed. This, we hope, will open a new chapter in Ms. Batts' battle. It is not over. We've just filed the federal complaint, but it is an important marker for the public to know the kinds of things that Ms. Batts has had to remain silent about for far too long. The kind of racial discrimination in this agency, the threat of retaliation, the conditions that Ms. Batts was told by employees could only be compared to a plantation, to a slave ship. She wasn't describing Baltimore in the 1860s or the 1950s. She was describing the Department of Public Works in 2020 and 2021. May this mark a turning point in this battle for Ms. Batts, a turning point in this battle for Local 44, and may it mark a turning point for the fight for equity and diversity, not as a slogan, but as true values that we care about in this city and in this agency that need it so badly. I want to have Ms. Batts share just a few words. I appreciate that you all understand that because there is now litigation pending and she is the lead witness. She will be limited in what she can say about the specifics, but I do want her to have a chance to tell her why this lawsuit was so important and why she has fought so long to make sure that it sees the light of day. Ms. Batts?
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Linda Batts. I am a born and bred Baltimorean. My parents came to Baltimore in the 1930s, armed with a third grade education for my mother and a sixth grade education for my father. They came here respectively for its promise and possibilities. They told my three brothers and me that hard work, a good education, are the values that underpin the integrity that you must live by and that you must bring to your workplaces. I had a distinguished federal career. I worked across 8 federal agencies with the best and brightest of leaders. They wanted me on board with them because they recognized that I had courage, I had knowledge, and I would do whatever I could to ensure that there was compliance with the anti-discrimination laws within the agencies, and that I would limit the taxpayers' exposure to any ill-founded behaviors and consequences in the workplace. I was absolutely honored to have been sought out by the City of Baltimore and the Department of Public Works to join city government in 2018. I believed it was an opportunity for me to understand the connection between what goes on inside these hallowed halls with the service that we receive throughout Baltimore's communities. Upon arrival, I was met with interest and complaints and concerns by employees almost immediately, from the Bureau of Water and Wastewater to the Department of Solid Waste, and from the men and women who worked in their yards. These employees almost universally, though working in 2 different departments, characterize their working environment as severely hostile, retaliatory, akin to a pre-Emancipation Proclamation colonial plantation type environment where the overseers scrutinize their every move, the white overseers in some instances, and in other instances, the black leaders who were anointed to be the ears and eyes for the overseers. They express concerns about having raised issues and brought them to management's attention, being retaliated against, given unfair shifts, unfair working assignments, being disciplined inappropriately. And when those complaints were either brought to management's attention or either filed through union or EEO grievances, they were subjected to retaliation, more aggressive surveillance in the workplace, alienation and blackballing by their colleagues and co-workers, and eventually termination. This kind of mistreatment, illegal treatment, breeds nothing but a chilling effect. What it says to any employee, any hardworking laborer in our Department of Public Works and throughout other city agencies is that there is a consequence for being courageous and speaking out. There's a consequence for change, and watch what happens to your other employees and learn from it. So there was a pervasive chilling effect. When I brought these issues to management's attention, many of these issues were disregarded, and further harsh treatment was levied against employees. And some of this is already documented in the press. I'm just absolutely, I will tell you, I have never seen a situation like this before. The irony of having a professional armed with the tools to make Baltimore better, not only on the inside, because what you get in your communities through the work of the Department of Public Works water and wastewater people, from the sanitation workers, what they bring to the public is a result of what they get on the inside. And when we say there needs to be better service, yes, there needs to be better treatment of the men and women who deliver those services. I advocated for better wages for the men and women who are on the front lines of public health calamities to make our city better. You've got men and women in these departments who come into this agency making $20 an hour, which is $5 more than a youth worker makes. A youth worker A 14 and 15-year-old youth worker makes 3/4 as much as a newly hired solid waste worker. Where is the equity there? While you have men and women running programs and carrying out this plantation environment who are making six-figure salaries and who are failing to dispense their jobs as integrity keepers, as managers, as leaders who set the stage for what needs to be done to improve our city, to honor the men and women who do the work. They're not being subject to any consequences, but the bread and butter of our agencies are. I brought this to management's attention time and time again, the numerous opportunities we had to be a leader. And some in city government recognize this. Certainly the mayor's office recognized it because I was asked to also assume responsibilities in the Office of Equity and Civil Rights and to extend my learning and my wisdom and my knowledge across Baltimore City. I will tell you, there has to be change. What I am saying here today is confirmed by the sentiments of our own elected official, Bill Henry, the comptroller, who in March of last year took to the press and said, our equity program is a universal failure, which means nothing is being done. And we see that play out time and time again as new policies are promulgated, as changes are trying to be implemented within Baltimore City, that the men and women who are supposed to uncover injustice inside of City Hall and as it affects our communities are not doing the work, but they're on the payroll being compensated. And when I tried to get managers and supervisors to be held accountable through their performance appraisal systems for honoring integrity, for honoring equal employment opportunity, for honoring the equity requirements, I got pushback from human resources and other officials. But I will tell you, it's the proverbial case of the fox guarding the hen house, because it took 3.5 or more years for my case to be heard through the bureaucracy. And the very people that I had complained against inside of city government were the very ones coordinating or ignoring the responses of the EEOC in my case. If you're the subject of my complaint, why are you also involved in the mechanics of my complaint? There should be an impartial third-party review and investigation. So I am here today to ask Baltimore to be better, to live up to all of those promises and expectations that you deliver in those speeches, that your press writers and your speech writers say. Bring them to life, actualize upon them. Do the right thing by the men and women who are charged to deliver services to make our city better, and clean up your administrative infrastructure and employ the people who have the courage and the knowledge, skills, and ability and the wisdom to make Baltimore a better city than it already is. I thank you.
That is the professional that Baltimore City fired for doing her job. Mr. Thomas?
How you doing? My name is Clarence Thomas, newly elected Vice President of Local 44, ASME, along with my counterpart, Stancil McNair. He's the president. He was unavailable. He couldn't make it here. I have to give a shout out to the rest of the board and committee, Kim Furby, Shakendra Diggs, Tamika Pettis, Teresa Blow, Doc, Zeus Collins, and Darrell Union. We are the new Local 44, and we stand with Ms. Batts on everything. I could tell you, this lady's been a fighter. Even when they got rid of her, she never gave up. She worked along with Doc Cheatham, who was one of my mentors personally that I know from Sandtown, Winchester area. And I will say this, we are going to make the difference in the change, and we're doing it now. I have felt the systematic racism. I've been countered with that. I've been pushed back. Everything she talked about, I have encountered. But I've stayed and I survived, and we're in a better place. We got the right people around us. Mr. Daru, he's speaking highly. We got some other people. So we're going to stand. We got to be the spokesman, and we got to be in the front lines to get our point across. And I will tell you, from this day forth, you got to be transparent. You got to be fair when it comes to that. Local 44 represents over 3,000 members, not just on DPW side, but municipal. We just found out we got almost 1,000 Hispanics that's part of my union. It's bigger than what you can imagine. So the old regime is getting out the way with their services and what they're trying to do, as well as the new people that's coming in. And we're just trying to make a difference so we can make our city great again. We got to get what we need to make sure everybody's good. A safe and environmental environment where the workers, the men and women of the city of Baltimore are safe, sound, and they can do their job to the best of their abilities. If they're getting bullied, if they're getting racism, if they're getting targeted or whatever, they're not going to give you 100%. And that could be a missing of a screw for a pipe that might eventually bust and flood the streets. Or it could be the trash removal that's not able to get done. We just got to do better. And I'll tell you this. Everybody want to know who the new Local 44. I just gave you the thing. My name is Clarence Thomas, and I stamped them. We here. Thank you, Ms. Batts, for everything. Thank you, Daru. Thank you all for y'all even taking time out, and we appreciate you. I'm going to turn it back over to him.
Thank you.
I'll take a few questions. I really need to underscore how remarkable it is that a representative from Local 44 with nothing but an invitation decided to come out here and for what I believe is the first time stood shoulder to shoulder with somebody who's been the victim of discrimination. This is what, frankly, your local union should have been doing all along, fighting for the employees, not siding with management. Any questions?
A couple. It sounds like yes, but if you could just reiterate, do you believe that this is an ongoing issue? And then also, are these allegations limited to one or two DPW facilities, or is this a systemic issue?
Yeah, as we lay out in a 15-page complaint, these are systemic allegations of racial discrimination, a culture of retaliation. Ms. Batts has provided example after example that is chronicled and cataloged in that 15-page federal complaint, from one facility to another, from one supervisor to another. At this time, we did not identify the name of each and every one of those supervisors, but they know who they are. And if you read the allegation and you know that you were in this meeting, you know who you are. To your question about it, whether it's ongoing, I have to remind myself that the things that Ms. Batts has been saying for months and really for years was recently confirmed in the report that the city itself commissioned to evaluate what was happening in DPW after the death of Ronald Silver. It was their report that said, if you complain about a truck that is too hot, they'll put you in a truck with no air conditioning. If you worry or complain about a medical condition, you are likely to be given longer shifts and longer and more dangerous routes. That was the city's own report conducted by the law firm it commissioned to evaluate this. So this is not some, anomalous supervisor who's got an axe to grind. This is what we have been hearing and seeing for years. I don't know when they're going to wake up and do something about it, but lawsuits have a funny way of making people pay attention.
If this had been litigated earlier, could it have prevented, say, what happened to Mr. Silver if some of these complaints had been investigated?
There is absolutely no question that there are 1,000 ways that the tragedy of Ronnie Silver could have been avoided. Ms. Batts was sounding the alarm. The Inspector General was sounding the alarm. Countless employees within the Department of Public Works were sounding the alarm. And some of them were retaliated against, some of them were just ignored, and some of them were fired. But they gave the City of Baltimore and the Department of Public Works as many opportunities as you possibly could to do the right thing, to fix the conditions, to follow the law, and to honor the humanity of our garbage workers, because you can't treat them like garbage forever. And this is the latest reckoning that the city's got to face.
So the firing happened and they said that they're going a different direction. But you said the position still existed. So
So we have no reason to believe that they did anything different than replace Miss Batts with someone who was going to be more compliant to their wishes, who was not actually going to stand up and fight for discrimination, who is not going to stand up and fight against the kinds of illegal violations of the civil rights laws and the anti-discrimination laws that Ms. Batts was originally brought in to do. And be clear, this is not an original story, right? A person is brought in to fix something, and they're fixing it a little too well, and all of a sudden they think this person's a troublemaker. They're not part of the solution. If you hire a watchdog, and that watchdog then barks, you don't fire him. That's what you brought him in for. This city just didn't realize they got an actual professional. They got an actual seasoned, trained professional who was going to do the job, who was going to stand up for them, who was going to have the courage of her convictions, who wasn't afraid, that didn't need to keep her job in order to do her job, and she paid the ultimate price. But she also knew that she wasn't going to rest. And here we are, 20 press conferences later on 1,000 other fights that Miss Batts and Mr. Thomas and Mr. McNair have been fighting, but this time with an opportunity to get justice in a federal court. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I appreciate your attention to this story.